Here is Van Dieman's Beeswax. This is too light a yellow for extended or general use. It has a very stable tone as paper changes, and it can shade, though you could exactly say it needs it. It does perform just as well on non-fountain pen friendly paper. I like the ink more than I should. It is fun for very subtle additions to notes, but painful to read if a full page of writing with it. I think it is obvious to say I'll pass on a bottle.
The pen for today is a Diplomat Aero. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see this very bright, light color of yellow, and this is readable for adding bits, but looking at all of this writing, you can see just how difficult it would truly be. Imagine a whole page of this. Now, it does not feather, does not spread. It does shade decent, as in if you look at choices on the second line, you see it starts mostly as that light tone, but the ES at the end does darken a bit. I kind of wish more of the writing was that darker tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Native Cornflower. Here is Van Dieman's Sailor's Delight. Here is Van Dieman's Blackened Seas. Here is Van Dieman's Leatherwood Honey Amber.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, not as well as on the Clairfontaine. I think if you're using this ink on this paper, you're losing the story here. There's so much that's just so much more difficult to read than it really should be. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It still doesn't feather, still doesn't spread, still shades just a tiny bit, but not nearly as much as it did on the last couple of papers. It is also more difficult to read with the yellow background of this paper. Now, the tone of this ink is not being affected by the tone of the paper, so we do have a little bit more opaque an ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just a little bit, the tiniest bit. This is hard to read with the quad rule background. The quad rule really just feels like it's covering over all of the writing, making it nearly impossible because of how much is going on the paper. Really bad choice if this is the type of paper you prefer. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more yellow inks.
Here is Califolio Bouton d'Or. Here is KWZ El Dorado.
Here is Montagrappa Harry Potter Hufflepuff.
Here is Sailor Studio 670.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is even lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, has only a couple of moments of shading, really gets completely into the background, and it disappears with the quad rule. If you're a student using this, you need to stop. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diatramentis Midnight Blue. Here is Dieman Oxblood. Here is Jeherban Blue Nuit.
Here is Colorverse Coffee Break.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, does spread a little bit, doesn't shade, still is incredibly difficult to read on the page. Truly something to avoid just because of how difficult it is to read. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding. We can see that it's deep into the paper. No real ghosting, but this would be a horrible ink to use in most writing situations.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Diplomat Aero has a fairly wet writing broad nib that gives a yellow that is technically usable. Off camera, I tried this in a wet fine and things didn't change at all. I do like this more than I really should, and if I were using it again, I would go for a wet pen regardless of its nib size.